Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. On the 14th of July, the French remember Bastille Day. This is when revolutionaries stormed the infamous Paris prison. It's regarded as the start of the French Revolution. How does the French Revolution differ from the American Revolution, and what were the philosophical foundations, and what were their philosophical foundations? What kind of societies did they seek to create, let alone did they eventually create? We're joined by my dear friend, Dr. Brad Birzer. He's the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies and Professor of History at Hillsdale College, a prolific author of numerous books, and including the award-winning Russell Kirk, American Conservative, J.R.R. Tolkien, Sanctifying Myth, Tolkien and the Inklings, and I could go on. Brad, so great to speak with you, my friend. How are you?
Hey, Marcus. It's great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, always an honor to reconnect with you. So,
likewise.
You and I enjoyed having numerous conversations, and this is one of those conversations. We really need to set the record straight about the philosophical, and dare I even say the spiritual thrust behind the two revolutions. They were not the same in conception and therefore in execution.
Yes, they're nothing alike, and I get so frustrated when I look at mainstream textbooks and they'll call this just the age of revolutions, and then they list the American and the French Revolution as if they're sister organizations in some way. And the French Revolution spiritually, I love the way you put that, Marcus, but spiritually as well as politically was the complete opposite. It was an inversion of the American Revolution. You know, the Americans were fighting for tradition. They were fighting for God-given rights. They had an understanding of what common law was. Law emerged from our experience. It was not imposed from the top down. And the French had exactly the opposite vision. They were taking so much of what they learned from, I would consider one of the most evil philosophers in history, a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They're taking from him and they're imposing everything from the top down. So in every way, it's the opposite of what we're doing in the American Revolution.
I'm so glad you brought up Rousseau. And so let's juxtapose his system of thought with the influence of John Locke. But as you and I know well, we would be remiss to simply say Locke was the philosophical father of the American Revolution. But let's talk about the influences of these two men and the two revolutions.
Rousseau is a really interesting guy. I mean, I despise him personally as well as professionally, but he's still interesting. And when we look at him, what he really argued, and I think that probably 500 years from now, when people look back at our time, they will count Rousseau as one of the most important thinkers, along with Marx and Nietzsche. Rousseau is so interesting because he really formulates through his book, The Social Contract, what we would call totalitarian democracy. And his argument is that democracy is so important that it really should replace the divine right of kings with the divine right of the people. And so his democracy is no less virulent than a rabid monarchy would be, or any ideological system. It's just that there's more consent involved, but it's consent of the majority or of the general will in this idea of really creating a kind of conformist society overall. So there are no rights of the minority within Rousseau's understanding. It is purely the general will, really what in practical terms would be the tyranny of the majority. But again, a fascinating figure, Marcus.
I agree with you. And if I may produce a bad analogy to illustrate exactly where you and I stand, I think interest in Rousseau is akin to interest in a plane crash. We don't think by any stretch of the imagination that it's a good thing, but we can't help but just keep wondering what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you know, Rousseau lived what he preached. He gave over his wife and his kids to the state. He was a despicable, absolutely despicable person, and ended up going to England and trying to live with David Hume, who arguably was the nicest guy in 18th century Scotland. And even Hume couldn't stand him. Hume had Rousseau at his house only for a weekend and then kicked him out after that. So this is really not a good guy at all in any way, shape, or form.
Well, if you incur the wrath of Hume that quickly, that's saying a lot.
It is saying a lot.
You brought up a point, Brad, that I think it's important for our listeners to understand. The difference between the abstract Rousseauan democracy that was trying to be pushed in the French Revolution versus the republic, if you can keep it, that was in the mind of the founders of the American Revolution.
Right. This really comes down to, if we look at the French Revolution, there's a moment in their equivalent of the Declaration of Independence, which was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen. And in Article number 3 of that declaration, it states that the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. And so notice there's in the way that the French put that, it's completely collectivist. Everything is only in the whole. Whereas, when we think about us, Marcus, you and I are friends because we're friends. Mm-hmm. Nobody told us we could be friends. We're friends because we like each other.
Yep.
You run a radio station, not because somebody told you to run the radio station, but because a group of investors got together and decided to create a radio station. Mm-hmm. And we do that all the time. We do it with families. We do it with schools. We do it with businesses. And that's deeply American. We're always creating community. Sometimes just two of us, sometimes 3, 4, whatever it may be. We're always creating community. But from the French understanding, the community comes first and everything is imposed from that community. Again, exactly the opposite of what the Americans think. And so that abstract democracy of the French is radically different from the ground-up republic of the Americans.
I'm so glad that you phrased it that way, because what that also demonstrates, Brad, so that our listeners really understand this, the American founders had a realism with how they approached not just the revolution, but the setup of government in terms of classical liberalism. The French ideal was pursuing an ideal abstraction, Rousseau, Machiavelli, that looked good on paper, but I don't see how it could have worked out other than the way it did.
Right, exactly. It is totalitarian, even though it's often presented in the language of liberty, and that it's one of Rousseau's greatest achievements. I mean, I think it's diabolical, but it's great that he is able to take the argument of Hobbes, but mix it with the language of Locke. And so he comes across sounding very libertarian, very democratic, but he really is creating nothing less than a totalitarian system. And his democracy is not at all what we would recognize as democracy in America. We think about someone like Thomas Jefferson in his first inaugural. He tells us, yes, we have the vote, but the vote only counts if the majority recognizes the legitimacy of the minority. If it ignores the minority, there's no legitimacy to the majority at all. And that's what Rousseau is getting at. Rousseau is allowing the majority to just run roughshod over everybody. And so again, when we think about the kind of late or early modern understanding of the divine right of kings, Rousseau is just giving that divine right to a majority rather than to a king, but it's no less evil.
I'm talking with Dr. Brad Birzer, Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies and Professor of History at Hillsdale College. We are talking about the fact that it's Bastille Day today, and therefore we get the privilege of re-looking at our history with appreciation for the blessing and brilliance of the American founding, and then juxtaposing it with the abstract and, dare I say, more chaotic French Revolution. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with my dear friend Dr. Brad Birzer, Russell A. McKirk Chair in American Studies and Professor of History at Hillsdale College. Brad, one of the things that we touched on that you alluded to so beautifully in the last segment is the moral onus of thinking of government rightly is also precisely so that when we think about the common good, those in the minority are not trampled underfoot. And I ask you, therefore, to speak about, say, the wisdom of something like the Electoral College and a system of a Republican government versus an abstract democratic vote of the masses, and how that ultimately destroys a civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a great question, Marcus. And such an important one for us today, where we use the terms republic and democracy interchangeably. We never should. It's a very dangerous thing. A republic always, by its nature, it imitates the three ways of knowing of man. So that the way that we as human persons know, we know through our mind, we know through our heart and soul, and we know through our stomach, through our passions. And a republic very intentionally mimics that. It says there is an executive, there is an aristocracy, and there is a democracy. So by its very nature, every republic must contain a democracy, but you would never allow the democracy to rule. It has to be a part of it. You'd be foolish not to incorporate it, but to allow the lower part of ourselves, our lustful part, the part that hungers after something, our passions, we would never allow that to rule the head or the chest. And that's what we've done. And it comes from the French Revolution. We have been horribly and deeply influenced by the French Revolution, and we've allowed that democratic element to just run wild through American history. And it really is akin to saying, let's let our passions control us. And of course, we know, Marcus, there's nothing wrong with our passions. I have 7 kids. I wouldn't have those kids without my passions. But I don't want to be ruled by those passions. I recognize how important they are. In the same way, at the moment, when we're recording this, I'm hungry. I'm ready for dinner. But I don't want to be ruled by that, right? We recognize it as important, but we don't allow it to rule. And that's what we've done, I think, very, very unintentionally. We've allowed that democratic element to get out of control. And I think it's very dangerous for America.
I couldn't agree more, because so if one were to be a student of not just the founding documents and the ancillary writings of the founding fathers, but also the influences of our founding fathers, what sense of a human person comes out in terms of their collective thinking?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, they're always thinking about the human person in a variety of ways. So not only are they thinking of the human person in the way a republic is formed, and we find that all the way back with Plato and Aristotle, but they're also thinking, and this is the downside of that, they're also thinking of the republic as imitating the human person in the sense that, like all human beings, we have a birth and a middle age and a death. And so when we go into a republic, this is why for the founding generation, a republic could last 20 or 30 years. They weren't thinking. And this is where we've succeeded and done brilliantly. We've just passed the 250 mark. That is unheard of for a republic that we've been able to do that. So please don't get me wrong, Marcus. I worry very much about the democratic element, but it still has not superseded the Republican element. We're still in pretty good shape overall.
Oh, I agree. And I did not... I had no concern, because you and I have had these discussions before, and therefore your diagnosis is one we have to pay attention to. It would be akin to a wound in a limb that's potentially becoming gangrenous if we don't address it and soon.
Exactly. Exactly. And I do think, though, we also have to recognize that when the founders created the republic, the common good was essential to it, the res publica, right?
Yeah.
It's really important. But the res publica comes from you're in my friendship. It comes from my marriage with my wife. It comes from having 7 kids. It comes from being a professor at Hillsdale College. It doesn't come from me owning an American passport, right? It really is this kind of ground up, the common good is you and me loving one another. It's not imposed from above. And that I think we have to be very careful about, because when we look at America, especially since the progressive period, we have allowed the political sphere to grow wildly. It has metastasized. And, politics is important. We're not anarchists. We don't shun all of politics, but we also make sure that it has its own sphere, and that sphere does not interfere with other spheres at all.
Just based on that, I'm also realizing that if you think about the writings of especially Washington, but also the Federalist Papers, John Adams, his correspondences with Abigail, it becomes clear that the way they thought of the Republic is the way one would think about a good human being. Do you get what I mean when I say that?
Yes, absolutely. Right. And again, there is that organic quality, not organic in the Darwinian sense, but organic in the Christian sense of the Logos and understanding the dignity of the human person. And you and I have talked about this before, Marcus, but, again, when we look at something like the Declaration of Independence, right, this idea that we truly do believe that man is made in the image of his creator. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That's a beautiful Republican statement about dignity. It's not a democratic statement, even though it's universal. It is a Republican statement about dignity, and that's something that I think we have to be very careful about in America, and we have to recognize this is both a conservative element but also a deeply radical element to the founding, that we would extend it to all men, all women, everywhere, regardless of skin color, regardless of gender, regardless of religion. All men are created in that image. And that's a powerful statement.
And so powerful a statement that France gifted us the Statue of Liberty. It didn't gift it to itself in a real sense. It gifted it to us.
Right. That is kind of wild, isn't it? I hadn't thought about that before. That's great, Marcus.
No, but I mean, the truth of it, that Lady Liberty is a personification of the way, it's not about liberalism as an abstract concept, but that an individual who's governed by morality and accountability to Almighty God and a well-formed reason, a well-informed populace, that's what liberty ought to look like. And so this becomes that beacon for the rest of the world for what liberalism can look like.
That's right. Properly understood, it is absolutely beautiful, right? But taken to the nth degree, it can be as tyrannical as any other system. And so that's why we don't want to make an ideology of it. And I tend to think, even though we call it republicanism, I tend to think of republicanism as a kind of anti-ideology in the way that conservatism is an anti-ideology. It's basically a recognition that life is incredibly complex, and it recognizes that, and it lives with it. If you think about something like the Declaration, it starts with a fundamental truth that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, but then it leaves us alone. It says, look, go off and be good. Go do good. And whatever that good is. So, Marcus, you and I, and I know I'm quite a bit older than you, but think about
by
this.
A few years at most.
Human persons. Yeah, no, and we're both human persons. We both bring certain excellences to the table, but we also bring the same sin to the table. Our sin is the same, but our excellences are unique. And my job as a human being is not to be jealous of your excellences, but to say, Marcus, look at what you do. Go forth in this community and flourish. We love those differences. We love them. We don't mechanize them. We celebrate them. And that, I think, is what the Declaration does so brilliantly. Here's Jefferson, and what does he say? This is man. Go flourish. Look at Marx. Marx says, no, this is man, and everything is related to this one thing, and let us conform. And that's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be Jeffersonian and let us go forth and be free, not Marx or Rousseau, and conform to all things.
Which raises that one of those fundamental questions of the equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. And from a Christian perspective, how that results in the real flourishing of the common good. I invite your wisdom here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, we think about what makes us unique in the image of God, right? Each one of us, as John Paul II said, we are each an unrepeatable center of dignity and freedom. And that by far, I think, is the best definition of the human person I've ever heard. I mean, John Paul just understood that brilliantly. And so each person is truly a new revelation of God's truth. And that's why life is so important from conception to natural death. Life is unique because it's a truth. It's an absolute truth. And I always think about it this way, Marcus. You think about hell. Hell is conformist. Hell is just dreary conformity. It's everybody being mushed into nothingness. Whereas what is heaven? Heaven is a celebration of all of our unique understandings that God gave us.
Brad, I could go on for hours with you. Thank you so much for your time. My guest has been Dr. Brad Birzer, Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies and Professor of History at Hillsdale College. We've been talking about Bastille Day and lessons that we as Christians can learn about the French and American Revolution. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.